Hello there, and welcome to the Corona for Cinema 4D multi-shader tutorial. In this one, we'll be taking a closer look at the incredibly powerful multi-shader in Corona. Now, before we dive into it, let's just quickly explain what the multi-shader actually does. So the multi-shader's main purpose is to give you an intuitive, easy-to-use yet powerful shader with which you can easily control color or texture variations in your materials. Great. So now let's quickly demonstrate what the multi-shader does on a couple of basic examples here. So in front of us, as you can see, we have three basic meshes, which are basically these guys here, the cylinder, the sphere, and the cube. And what's special about these guys is that they all have the same set A material applied to them, right? It's the same material, and it's this guy down here, which basically just has a reflection channel and a diffuse channel. But what's special about it is that the diffuse channel, the diffuse color, is actually being driven by the Corona multi-shader. Now I have the interactive renderer already running, and as you can see, the viewport is not quite fully representative of what we got here. And basically what we can see is that each of these guys has its own color, and that is because of the multi-shader. So now if I, for example, select all these guys here and start duplicating them like this, well, now what you're going to see is that in the interactive renderer, the colors are getting randomized, right? So each of the lines here basically has a different color scheme. And so that's entirely being driven by the multi-shader that's in this one set A material. So we can use one material to drive all of these variations. Right. So it's not only those big type of variations that you can drive with the multi-shader, you can also drive more subtle ones. In the scene in front of us, you can see that we have three trees, and if I bring up the interactive renderer and zoom in on one of these trees, you can see that we have our leaves sort of being randomized on a per leaf basis. And this is being entirely driven by a single multi-shader powered Corona material. So let me bring up that leaf material here, and as you can see, we have our diffuse channel, again, being entirely driven by the Corona multi-shader. And this is what's driving this sort of leaf variation here. Now if we go into the translucency channel, you can also see that we're driving the translucency with the Corona multi-shader. And that's also kind of helping us make these variations stand out a little bit more. Now granted, the result in front of you isn't totally realistic, but that's besides the point here. We've amplified the variations a bit more here so that they stand out a little bit more. But ultimately, just imagine how powerful the multi-shader is here, because with it, you can now essentially drive that subtle per leaf variation you'd normally see on a tree in real life. So basically, you can create some really realistic variations really quickly with the multi-shader. Now, alright, that was just a really quick basic demonstration of just how powerful the multi-shader can be. Now that we have a basic idea of what the multi-shader does, let's go over how we can actually set it up and how it works. So we're starting anew here, and as you can see, we have our three hero objects here, and they don't have any materials applied to them, as you can see. So now let's start at the very beginning here, and let's create a new Corona material, and let's apply this material to our object here, like this. There we go. Now if I bring up the interactive renderer, you can see that we have our basic Corona material indeed applied. Now let's say we want to bring in the multi-shader so that we can distribute a couple of different colors randomly across our objects here. Before we do that, let me just quickly bring up the Corona nodal material editor, and then I'll just simply drag in our newly created Corona material in here. There we go. Now to bring in the actual multi-shader, what I'll do is I'll right click somewhere in the empty part of the canvas here, and I'll go under New Shader, Plugins, Corona, and I'll select the Corona multi-shader here. Right, so just by doing that, we've now brought in the multi-shader, but we still have to connect it to our material. Now, because we only have the diffuse channel active in our material, as you can see, we can only plug it into the only available input field here, which is the texture input field in our diffuse channel. If we, for example, also had the reflection channel enabled, so if I enable it real quickly here, you can see that now we can plug in the Corona multi-shader into any of its input fields here. And the same goes if I were to enable, say, the bump channel as well. We can now plug in the Corona multi-shader into the bump input right here. Right, now let's connect this multi-shader that we created here to the diffuse texture slot of our material. And before you know it, the interactive renderer updates and we see the multi-shader in action. So great, that's essentially how you bring in the multi-shader and connect it to your materials. Now let's talk about its properties and how we can use it. Okay, so by clicking on the Corona multi-shader node here, you're going to see that this properties window is going to appear here, and this is where most of your Corona multi-shader magic is going to happen. Now the first thing that we should probably talk about are these layers down here. As you can see, we have a layer count parameter up here, which is currently set to 6. And if I subtract from the layer count, you're going to see that we're going to have less and less layers. And if I add to the layer count, we're going to have more layers. Now, because we don't have any textures or shaders applied to each of these layers, they're reverting back to their color settings. And as you can see, we currently, because we only have 3 objects, we have the orange applied to one of the objects, we have the green applied to one of our objects, and the blue color applied to one of our objects, right? And so this is obviously being kind of randomized in the way it's being applied to the object, and you can control that randomization by controlling the seed parameter up here. So right now it's set to 0. If I tweak it a little bit, well, now you can see that it uses a different seed essentially, and it's just using all of these different layers and kind of randomly applying them onto our objects here. Now, obviously, if you aren't using textures and you are relying on the colors here, you can obviously open up one of these colors and, just tweak it to your heart's content, right? That should go without saying, but just in case you didn't know that, yeah, you can definitely change these colors here. Now, using colors is all fine and dandy, but I suspect that most of the time you're going to want to use the texture sort of slot here to load in your textures. And obviously there are multiple ways you can do that. You can click on this down triangle here and go under load image or load one of the shaders. Or alternatively, what you can also do is you can just drag and drop your textures into the node material editor and connect them to the texture input fields here. So let me just quickly fill this up with a couple of different wood textures here. All right, let's connect them. And now because we only have 3 wood textures, let me also adjust the layer count to 3, right? So that we don't have any of the color layers being mixed in. And now, as you can see in the interactive renderer, now these textures are being loaded in and randomly applied to our objects. And again, if I mess with the seed parameter, obviously the randomization is going to look a little bit different. Now at this point, this might be obvious to some of you, but just in case you didn't know, if you do want to kind of tweak your textures, you can still do that. You can, for example, add a shader, like a filter shader in here, connect it to the wood material itself, and then connect this one into the texture slot. And well, now you have more control over your textures, as you can see, right? So doing all of these kind of like elaborate node setups, that's entirely possible even when you're working with the Corona multi-shader here, right? Okay, now let's hop back into the Corona multi-shader properties here and let's talk about the gamma random and hue random values. I'm going to up the gamma random value to about 50%, which is going to be a bit of an insane value, really. And as you can see, yeah, it's not looking that particularly good. But what this kind of demonstrates is that just by using this particular parameter, we can randomize the gamma on a per object basis here without adjusting any of the texture maps here. So 50% obviously is a little bit too much typically, but it really depends on what you do. But typically I use values of around 0 to 15%, but obviously it really depends on what you're trying to achieve. And essentially you're just randomizing the gamma on a per object basis here. Now the hue random does something very similar. Let me just reset this parameter here. And if we up the hue random value here, you can see that now we're just messing with the hue of each of these textures as they're getting applied on the object. So value of 100%, you're probably not going to use that very often, but for randomizing the colors just a little bit, well, maybe a value of 10% might do just fine. And both of these settings really work well if, for example, you have just one texture, right? So if I only had this wood texture in all of my input slots here, well, now you'll be able to see that, yeah, you can see we have a couple of different hues here. And if I reset the hue setting to 0, they're all going to look the same, right? And so this becomes a very powerful way of randomizing the hue or the gamma to create an extra realistic variation. Okay, so one of the parameters we still need to talk about is this mix amount parameter. And for this guy, if I put it to 100% right now, you're going to see that there are 0 changes, right? Nothing changed. And why is that? Well, it's because we're using this one texture and we're mixing between them, right? At 100%. So because it's just one texture being mixed with the same texture, essentially, nothing happens. But if, for example, I were to bring in this bitmap here, put into texture slot 1, and put this guy into texture slot 3 here, well, now you're going to see that now we're mixing between all 3 of these. And so this is at a mix amount of 100%, but if we drop this to 0, you can see that now each texture looks the way that it should. And essentially what this does, it just blends the values between the different textures that you have in here. All right, well, that covers the mix amount. And let me just drop it back to a value of 0. And before we move on and explore the mode parameter or mode menu drop down here, let's talk a little bit about a pretty cool tip, and that is the batch load texture option. So right now, if I were if I had a lot of textures that I wanted to load, I would need to drag them in one by one. Well, you don't have to do that. If you have a bunch of textures all clumped up in a folder somewhere, you can just click on the batch load texture here, scroll to that particular folder, and then what you can do is you can just select the textures that you want, hit open, and before you know it, you're going to see that all of these textures are now in your nodal material editor, and they are already connected to your multi shader, just like that. Right, and this enables you to just quickly load all kinds of textures and already have them plugged in, and so it's kind of like a really great workflow shortcut, if you will. All right, now we might have saved the best for last, and what I'm talking about is this mode parameter mode menu here. Right now it's set to objects, and what this essentially means is that it will apply these layers randomly across objects, and that is why we can only use one material on all of our different objects here, meshes, and get this variation going, right? So if I change the seed here, again, you can see that it's just varying these layers across all of our objects here, and that is because we have the mode set to objects. If I expand this drop down here, you can see that we have a bunch of different options available to us. So let's go through these slowly and one by one. The first mode that we're going to take a look at is the primitives mode here. So if I select it, you're going to see a change in our interactive renderer here. Now this might look like a bunch of gibberish, but essentially what is going on is that all of your objects are getting sort of subdivided into primitives. What that means is that each quad that you have is going to get turned into a primitive, which essentially means it's going to get turned into a triangle. So as you can see, now we're sort of distributing these layers, these colors here, and we don't have texture, so we're just using colors, right? And we're just distributing these guys across all of the primitives that are in our scene. Now, again, we are using quads for our meshes here. If I go into the display mode, quick shading, or better yet, constant shading, you're going to see that, yeah, we're definitely using quads here. But Corona does all of these conversions to primitives on its own, right? So let's change the seed value a little bit here. And now, again, as you can see, we're just playing around with the seed. And this is just a different way of distributing all of these layers. All right, well, the next mode that we're going to be taking a look at is the material name mode. And if I select it, you're going to see that in the interactive renderer, all of our objects are now the same color, which is this yellow layer color, right? Right. Now, the way the material name mode works is that it randomizes these layers based on the material's name. That might sound confusing to some of you, so let's demonstrate it. Let's first select our main material here, and let's call it A. Let's just call it A, material A, right? Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate it and call this duplicated material B, or better yet, just B. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to just select this Corona multi-shader that is driving material A. I'm going to plug it into our material B. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to select this material B and apply it to our sphere. And now as you can see, the randomization happens based on the material's name. Now if I were to rename this guy, this B material back to A material, you can see that it's going to turn yellow. And if I name it B again, because it has a different name now, the Corona multi-shader is going to use a different layer for it. And the seed parameter and all of these guys here, they work exactly the same as they did before, so we can randomize things the way we see fit. Alright, so that is the gist of the material name mode. Next up, we're going to be taking a look at the material ID mode. So if I select it, you're going to see that in the interactive renderer, all of our objects are now being driven by the same layer. And the reasoning for that is quite simple. One extra thing to note with the material ID mode is that you're also going to have a couple of parameters like the seed parameter grayed out. And you'll see why in just a second. So essentially, if I go under material A here and under advanced, under the advanced tab, you're going to see that we have this material ID option down here. And right now it's set to 0. If I set it to 1, it's going to be red. If I set it to 2, it's going to look orange. And if I set it to 3, it's going to look yellow. Now why is that? Well, it's quite simple, really. If you take a look at, let's just set the material ID to 2 here, so it's going to be easier to explain. If I go back into the Corona multi-shader, you're going to see that under layer 2, we have this orange layer. And this layer directly corresponds to the material ID number here. So if I put this number to 1, you're now going to see that our objects that have this material applied to it are being driven by layer 1. And conversely, for our B material, which is currently set to material ID 0, which is automatically going to select the last layer in your list here with the highest number. If we, for example, set the material ID here to say 3, well, now the sphere, which has the B material applied to it, this sphere is now going to be yellow, because if we go under the Corona multi-shader, under layer 3, we have our yellow color. So it's pretty straightforward, although it might sound a little bit confusing, but once you get used to it, this really enables you a more granular control over how you distribute, or better yet, randomize things with the multi-shader. And it becomes even more powerful once you start nesting multiple multi-shaders together. Alright, so that is the gist of the material ID mode. The next mode that we'll be taking a look at is the object buffer ID mode. And believe it or not, this one is very, very similar to the material ID mode, with the only difference being that you don't have to go under the material and under the advanced tab and mess with the material ID setting. What you'll be doing essentially is you'll be applying a Corona compositing tag and mess with the object buffer's ID in there. Now, just to make things a little bit simpler, let's delete our B material because we just simply aren't going to use it. And let's make sure that our remaining A material here is applied to all of our primitives. And as you can see, it is. And so now let's go into the Corona multi-shader and let's switch from the material ID mode to the object buffer ID mode. Great. Well, as I've alluded to earlier, we're going to have to use the Corona compositing tag for this one. So let's just go in here and apply just a basic Corona compositing tag to all of our primitives here, just one by one, like this. Great. With that done, let's open up one of the Corona compositing tags here so that we can see its properties. And as you'll see, we have this object buffer sort of menu here, right? And so if I just select all these tags and set all of them to say buffer ID 1, well, now you're going to see that all of my primitives that have this material applied to them are red. And if I select object buffer 2, well, now they're a bit orangish. And if I select buffer ID 3, now they're yellow. And this works very similarly to the material ID mode. because if you'll remember, these buffer IDs kind of directly correspond to the layers that you have in your Corona multi-shader here, right? So buffer ID 3 is being matched with layer 3 here, and because we aren't using textures, we're just using this layer color here, right? Right. Now, to better illustrate this point, let's just take two of these materials here, and let's apply buffer ID 1 to them. And now, as you can see, the cylinder, which is the only one that has the buffer ID 3 here, is the one that's yellow. And again, so this is super useful. You need to get a hang of it, but similarly as the material ID, this can come really, really handy once you get a feel for it. Figure out where it can help you. All right, so the next mode we'll be taking a look at is the material tag index mode. Now, to save some time, I've already gone ahead and I've deleted the Corona compositing tags here, but that's the only change I made to the scene. So you don't really need to worry about what happened behind the scenes here. Right, so the material tag index. Well, let's try to explain this one in the most straightforward way possible. So each of these tags you see here in the object manager has an index number to it, and it goes from left to right. So right now, because we only have one tag here, this this material tag has an index of 1. But if we duplicate it, well, now going from left to right, we have an index of 1, and this second material has an index of 2. And if we duplicate it again, well, now we have an index of 3 here. And if you've paid attention to the interactive render, you can now see that our cube is yellow. And this, again, is a very similar functionality to the material ID and the object buffer ID 1. It's just that we're getting our IDs from the material tag indexes. And so now, as you can see, an index of 3, again, corresponds to our layer 3 here. And so this can be a little bit confusing at first, but once you really find a workflow for this kind of functionality, it can really be immensely useful for those complicated distributions that you kind of want to drive non-destructively. So again, the gist of it here is that all these material tags here, so let's try it with the sphere here, right? So if this material tag here has an index of 1, and if we duplicate it, it has an index of 2. And if we have another material tag applied here, well, now it has an index of 3. And again, you can see what's going on in direct render. And so index of 3 corresponds directly to layer 3. And just one quick, very important note here, as the name of the mode suggests, material tag indexes only apply to material tags. So if you have any other tags applied to your objects in the object manager, they aren't going to mess with your material tag indexes, okay? So yeah, I implore you to kind of think about where you can use this functionality, because personally speaking, I had some problems understanding where I could sort of incorporate this into my workflow, but once I found the use cases, it became immensely helpful. All right, so that's the sort of the basics of the material tag index mode. Now, for the last mode we'll be taking a look at, which is the mesh element mode, we'll kind of clean up the scene just a little bit here. So I'm going to select all these materials, or better yet, material tags, and just remove them because we don't need them anymore. Great. Now, let's talk about the mesh element mode. And by the way, the mesh element mode is one of the modes that I most often use because it's really a useful mode. So as you can see right now, we're using the mesh element mode. We have the same material applied on all of our primitives here. And if I mess with the seed setting here, you're going to see that it kind of acts like the object mode would, right? So if I switch to the object mode, you can see that this is pretty much sort of the same behavior. But with the objects mode, if I, for example, sort of collapse all of these primitives into one object, basically connect object plus delete command in my case here. So what we've essentially did, we kind of collapsed all of those separate meshes into sort of one combined mesh, which kind of features all of them. So we still have our sphere, our cube, and our cylinder, but they're all just one object, right? Right. Well, with the object mode here, if I now change the seed, well, you're going to see that it's going to change all of our meshes here sort of simultaneously, because it treats all three of them as one object. Because quite frankly, in the object manager, that is exactly how things are set up. Now, if I switch to the mesh element mode here, well, now you can see that even though we have this one material applied on our one object here, but because it's comprised of multiple meshes, well, now the seed parameter is actually going to sort of play with the seed, or better yet, it's going to drive the randomization on a per mesh element basis. And now you can see now the sphere is yellow. And if we play around with the seed, now all of them are red. And now the cylinder is sort of yellow. And if I change this sort of orangey color here to green to better drive my point, well, now you can see that, yeah, we're essentially driving the randomizations based on a mesh element basis, right? And so you're probably wondering, well, how can this be useful to me? Well, it can be really useful because, for example, if you had a giant tree with a lot of leaves, and those leaves were sort of separate mesh elements, well, then you could just apply this one material, drive it with the mesh element mode, with the Corona multi-shader, and you could quickly randomize the colors of those leaves. Now, as a bit of a bonus tip, how do you know when your singular object in the object manager is comprised of multiple mesh elements? Well, typically you can go into the polygon mode here, and if you can double click on a mesh element or what you think is a mesh element, and if it selects this particular polygon group as a whole, well, then that is one mesh element. So in my case here, if I double click on the sphere group here, it selects the entire sphere. So that's one mesh element. And if I double click on the cube here, that is another mesh element. And if I double click on the cylinder here, well, this is another mesh element. So hopefully that kind of helps you out in case you were confused as what exactly constitute as a mesh element. All right, well, that covers pretty much all the basics when it comes to setting up the multi-shader up from scratch, and it also covers most of its functionality. Now, to finish this tutorial off, we're going to take a look at a couple of practical examples of where the multi-shader can come in handy. Again though, the way you can use the multi-shader to help yourself out is not just limited to what we're showing here, because truly, the way you can use it is really limitless, and it's a really useful tool. But okay, enough of that, let's take a look at our first example scene here. Alright, so immediately you can see that this scene is very similar to the one we've showcased before with the primitives. The only difference being is that instead of the primitives, we now have these three trees in here, right? And so what we'll be doing in this particular example is we'll be applying a leaf material to our trees. Now, before we actually go ahead and do that, let's talk a little bit about how these trees are set up. So if we take a look at the object manager, you can see that our tree is basically just one single mesh, right? And if we go into the polygon mode, you can see that that's most definitely true. The entire tree is just one mesh. Now, we do have these selection tags here, and we have a bunch of materials that are being applied with the help of these selection tags, right? And so if I double click on this particular selection tag, you can see that we have this sort of trunk part of the tree selected. And if I click on the other selection tag here, you can see that we have these main branches, I suppose. And all of these are kind of split up. And so it kind of makes it easier to apply a material to just a particular part of the mesh. Now, as you can see, one of these selection tags helps us in selecting just the leaves on the tree. And that by itself is very useful on its own. But let's explore, or better yet, let's dive deeper into how this tree is actually modeled. So what I'm curious about is if these leaves are basically polygon groups or mesh elements. So I'm going to just double click on one of these leaves. And yes, as you can see, by double clicking on it, we've now just selected this polygon group or this mesh element, right? And so this is going to be very useful because just by doing this, I already know that I'll be able to use the multi-shader in the mesh element mode to drive the variation of each individual leaf on this tree. Alright, so let's create our leaf material. The first thing that I want to do is I want to go into the Corona menu here and create a new Corona material, and then I'm going to open up the nodal material editor and just drag this newly created material in here. Great. Now the next thing that I want to do is I want to drag in my textures. I do have two leaf textures, and as you can see, they look kind of similar, but they do have a bit of a different hue, right? Right. Now, in order to apply these to our tree, we obviously will need to use the Corona multi-shader. So let's bring that in. I'm going to right-click in my nodal material editor, go under New Shader, Plugins, Corona, and I'm going to select the Corona Multi-Shader. There we go. Now the first thing that I do want to set is I want to set the mode from Objects to Mesh Element. And then I want to drop the layer count to 2 because we obviously only have 2 textures here, right? Right. So now the next thing that I want to do is I want to plug these guys in, and we're almost done. The next thing, and the only remaining thing that we kind of have to do still, is just connect the Corona Multi-Shader into the diffuse slot of our material here. Now, because we are only using 2 textures for our leaves, we can play around with the hue random and gamma random values just a little bit. So I'm going to up these values to like 2% on each. And this is just going to introduce a bit of extra variation on a per leaf basis, even though we only have 2 textures. Right, now with all that done, we can round out this material. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring in my translucency texture, just because, you know, leaves are translucent. So I'm going to enable translucency here, go under its sort of menu, and then just plug this guy into the second translucency slot like this. Now the fraction could be a little bit lower, maybe 25%. And then the only thing perhaps that I do still want to do is, because my leaves kind of will look blocky if we don't use the opacity map that's provided for them, I'm also going to bring in the opacity map. And with the opacity map, my tip is that you actually bring it in as a Corona bitmap. If you just drag it in to the nodal material editor or anywhere else, really, it's going to come in as a bitmap shader. But ideally for opacity maps, you'll want to be using the Corona bitmap. So this is this guy here. Now, the main reason to use the Corona bitmap for your opacity maps is that you'll be seeing a lot better performance if you're using the Corona bitmap instead of the normal Cinema 4D bitmap shader. So because I already have the bitmap shader here with the file sort of, which is pointing to the file, I'm just going to copy the file path and paste it into the Corona bitmap and plug this guy into the opacity slot. And that's pretty much it. Now, you could obviously still tweak this material. It does need some reflection, so let's enable reflection. You could plug in any kind of a map in here, really, in order to get a more realistic result. But we are kind of slightly focused on just setting up the multi-shader for now, right? Okay, so now with this material, we can name it properly, and then we can drag it onto our tree. But before we do that, let me just bring up my interactive renderer so that you can see how things look like right now. And as you can see, the tree obviously already has quite a few materials applied to it, but we are missing that leaf material. So I'm going to apply my leaf material, and lo and behold, voila, we now have our tree looking like a tree would look like. Now again, you could obviously still tweak this to your heart's content. We could maybe tweak the hue random and gamma random values. What we could actually do is we could create, or better yet, bring in a new Corona multi-shader and plug in this particular translucency bitmap into the texture slot 1. Make sure that the multi-shader is actually set to the mesh element mode, and the layer count to 1 because we only have 1 texture here. And now how we could use this is we could just randomize the gamma and hue a little bit on this translucency texture, and this is going to create even more of that realistic variation. And yeah, that kind of concludes our practical example number 1 here. As you can see, the multi-shader is extremely useful in this particular case because, quite frankly, I don't know what other way there is to apply a single material that's going to create this nice variation, right? You would probably have to split each and every leaf on your tree into its own and then have a zillion materials in order to achieve the same result. What we did here, we just used a couple of Corona multi-shaders and we're driving some seriously impressive leaf variations on our tree. Alright, so for our second practical example, we'll be working with this elephant toy model here. Let's just for a second imagine that we have a client that wants us to render out a store shelf full of these elephant toys, but they do want each to have a bit of a different combination of colors of the fabric. Right, so before we actually go in and start creating and applying materials and doing the multi-shader magic, let's just first examine our model here. So as you can see, we have our elephant toy main sort of parent null here, and underneath it we have a bunch of different meshes. So one mesh is all about the eyes, the other one is labeled body, other, and this one kind of has all of these other parts here. And as you can see, they're kind of split into its own, so we kind of are working with different mesh elements here. And then we also have our body main mesh, which is basically the main part of the elephant's body here, I suppose. And so our lovely client wants us to apply these kind of different colored but very similar fabric textures to each of these parts, except the eyes, of course. Right, and that's basically it. We do have two different instances here of our elephant toy main mesh, and that's just going to kind of help us see how the materials sort of propagate from one instance to another. So with all that said, let's start tackling this scene. So the first thing that I'll do is I'll create a new Corona material, and I'm going to call it the eyes material. Now the eyes on these toys are typically sort of this black plasticky material, so I'm going to dial in a dark color for the diffuse channel here, and I'm also going to enable the reflection channel and just dial down the glossiness. And this is going to be our basic eyes material. Now obviously we could put in some glossiness maps to break up the reflections a little bit, put in some bump maps, but let's just try to keep things just a little bit simple and relevant to what we're trying to convey here. All right, so for our body other and body main sort of meshes, we'll be using just one single material because we'll be leveraging the power of the multi-shader quite extensively, really. So let me show you what I mean. Let's create a new Corona material, and let's call this material fabric material. All right, now let's bring up the Corona nodal editor here because it's just going to make the overview of the material a little bit easier to digest. Right, so I've brought this in, and now I'm going to bring in a Corona multi-shader. And this guy, I'm going to set it to be using the mode of object buffer IDs. And I'm going to plug this guy into the diffuse slot right here. All right, so this might sound a little bit confusing, but bear with me. So the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to apply a tag, a Corona tag, to my body main mesh here, and it's going to be the Corona compositing tag. And under the object buffer setting, I'm going to enable object buffer 1. Now I'm going to do the same thing for my body other mesh, and I'm going to bring in the Corona compositing tag and tag, or better yet, enable object buffer 2. Right, so you might kind of see where this is going already, but if you're not, don't worry, we'll explain everything in detail. So in the Corona multi-shader that we created before, we're going to drop the layer count to 2. And now this basically means that because we're using the object buffer ID mode, we are mapping one of these slots to one of these sort of compositing tags here. So as you can see, slot 2 is going to go into the object buffer ID 2 here, and slot 1 is going to go into our object buffer ID 1 here. Right. Now let's create another Corona multi-shader. And for this one, we're going to have the mode be set to object because we want it to vary based on the instance, or better yet, based on the we want to randomize it on a per object basis essentially. Now I do have a texture for this one ready, so let me just drag it in here. All right, here we go. And now what I'll do is well, maybe we can drop the layer count to kind of 4 here, just to make things a little bit easier and easier to demonstrate. So we're going to be using this bitmap, and we're going to plug it into the texture slot 1 here. And then because I'm just going to use one single texture, you could be using multiple, but because I only have one, I'm going to bring in the filter shader. I'm going to plug this bitmap into the filter and then plug the filter into the second texture slot of our Corona multi-shader here. Now under the filter, I'm just going to randomize the color a little bit with the hue and saturation values, because let's say that this is the exact color that the client wanted, okay? Great, now I'm going to copy this filter shader by dragging Control or Command if you're on Mac, and then I'm just going to relink everything, and just create another sort of copy here that has a different color, and then I'm just going to repeat the process for our last filter shader here. All right, there we go. Now, this is going to be our body main material, right? Or better yet, body main texture. So we're just going to drag it into the first texture slot because remember, texture slot 1, because it's set to object buffer ID 1, is only going to be applied to where our compositing tag is set to 1, right? And don't forget, it has to be a Corona compositing tag. So by doing that, if I bring up the Corona interactive renderer, not much is happening because we actually don't have our material applied to our meshes here. So let me just apply it to both of our meshes here. And now, as you can see, we have pretty much perfect randomization on our body main mesh of the elephant. So remember this guy, right? As you can see, it's distributed using these sort of parameters here, these textures and filters. Now, obviously, well, this kind of went out of control here for a second. I apologize for that. Now we obviously still have the ears and all these other parts here to set up. So we're going to do that by bringing in, well, another Corona multi-shader here. And it's also going to be set to objects mode. And we're going to bring in a different texture. All right, here we go. And as you can see, it's just a bit of a different fabric texture. And we're going to plug this guy into the texture slot 1 here. And then again, because we only have one texture, we're just going to randomize it using the filter and kind of get the color that the client wants. So maybe this is a good color for our client. And then we're going to randomize it a little bit more here. You know, the client likes this sort of purple color. You know, he's a big fan of purple rain and stuff. So let's create another one. And I think this should probably be enough. So we have 4 textures. So let's make sure that the layer count is set to 4. Let's make sure that the mode is indeed set to objects mode. And now we just need to plug this guy into our second texture slot in our object buffer sort of multi-shader here. And voila, ladies and gentlemen, students and masters, this is how you can use the multi-shader to kind of randomize things and keep them super tidy, right? Because we're just using this one material. Now, to be perfectly honest, we could totally improve this setup, right? I mean, the textures are all out of whack, and kind of looking at it, maybe we could even reverse them, right? So what we could actually do here is kind of made a mistake. We need to rewire these 2 parameters to kind of reverse the colors. And yeah, maybe this is a better setup, right? Maybe we made a mistake. And as you can see with the multi-shader, these adjustments are a matter of just, you know, replacing 2 sort of, or better yet, switching 2 wires in the normal material editor. Now, in all honesty though, this kind of works when you have super similar materials and you don't have to reproduce a ton of detail, right? Because say for example, our body main fabric would be this, I don't know, this cotton material, right? And our body other material would be this crazy velvet material. Well, then obviously we wouldn't be able to control both of these vastly different materials through this one material, through this one Corona material, right? And in that instance, you could probably just create another Corona material and, you know, just do the multi-shader magic and apply it to the other mesh, right? But all in all, this particular demonstration here was just an example of how you can use the Corona multi-shader to keep things tidy whenever you can, right? Obviously, again, if you had a more complex sort of model where the material, really, you have 2 vastly different materials, then you're probably going to want to use 2 Corona materials and then have a multi-shader in each one of those, right? You could do that, and that would probably be the smart way if you really want the detail. But if this is going to be sitting on a shelf somewhere and you don't need that detail and the fabrics are very similar, then you can just drive them using one material. And if the client comes back for you for changes, you know, the power of the Corona multi-shader in this case I think is pretty obvious. Right, so this basically wraps up our tutorial here. We always encourage you to experiment. We also encourage you to take a look at the 3ds Max tutorials, which, you know, the interface is different, but you might get an idea of what you can do with the different techniques. And if you're a 3ds Max user, the same applies for you. Take a look at the C4D tutorials, and you're probably going to get an idea of how you can apply a different technique in your own workflow, right? Because all in all, to be honest, the workflow is very, very similar. Yes, there's different terminology sometimes, but essentially a lot of the functionality is super similar. So yeah, thank you for sticking with me. I hope you've learned a lot, and I wish you happy experimenting with the multi-shader. It's a very useful functionality, and once you wrap your head around the different options that you have with the multi-shader, then it becomes a real treat to use it. Thank you for tuning in.